Friends, welcome to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me, and we're starting. It all started so innocently. My wife and I went shopping on Michigan Avenue. Jane was looking for a new outfit for our upcoming 25th anniversary party. She found a beautiful dress and 2 pairs of matching shoes, but couldn't decide which pair to choose. So I suggested we go to Gibson's for a drink and get our daughter-in-law's opinion. Jane agreed. After a 2-hour shopping trip. She was ready for a drink, and it would be nice to surprise Taylor since we haven't seen her for a long time. We assumed that Taylor, our sister-in-law, would be working today, as she usually tried to take the Saturday shift. She claimed that tipping on a Saturday is always better. Our son Paul was out of town last week. He has been collecting testimony and information related to a court case he is working on. Paul works for the district attorney's office, and although he wasn't allowed to go into details, he hinted that the case was connected to the Russian mafia, and he talked to several former people who were in the Federal Witness Protection Program. Jane and I hailed a taxi for a short trip to Rush Street. It was only 6 blocks away, but Jane's legs were giving out. Jane just has to wear 10-centimeter heels when she goes shopping on Michigan Avenue. Something about looking the part. I've been married long enough to know to keep my mouth shut and not point out the lack of logic in her shoe choices. The taxi dropped us off in front of the restaurant. It was noon, so it had to be the slowest time on Taylor's shift. If we're lucky, we'll be able to chat for a few minutes while enjoying cocktails and snacks. When I opened the restaurant door for Jane, I immediately noticed Taylor at the back of the bar. It is difficult not to notice her because she has 175 centimeters of Scandinavian beauty. Taylor was talking to another waiter, but there was an intimacy in their pose that set off alarm bells in my head, including the fact that Taylor's hand was on the waiter's shoulder. The maitre d' was not at the entrance when we entered, so we stood there for a full minute. I didn't take my eyes off Taylor during that minute. I was a little surprised by the way they looked at each other. I looked at Jane to see if she had the same reaction. I asked the head waiter for a table in the Taylor section, and after Taylor left, I finally looked away from the other waiter. On her way to our table, she put on her charming waitress smile, which disappeared the second she recognized us, and was replaced by an expression of shock and concern. "Mom, Dad, what a surprise." Taylor's voice was a little strained, and she was clearly trying to put a smile back on her face. Jane answered her. "Taylor, we just came in for a drink and to get your opinion on some shoes. We've been shopping for hours now, and we both need a drink. As usual, is Basil Hayden pure for you, Dad, and Grey Goose Rocks for Mom? Would that be great, plus one of those cheese plates, please?" "There's no hurry, Taylor. How did you spend this week while Paul was out of town?" I asked. "I was very busy and very lonely. I missed Paul and hope he comes home soon. There's nothing wrong with the job. I'm training Carlo, the new waiter." Taylor looked as she said this, and much disappointment. Carlo winked at her gaze. Taylor ran away, saying, "I'll get you some drinks," and most likely told Carlo to cool off in the presence of her husband's relatives. Carlo gave us a quick glance and kitchen. I took advantage of Taylor's absence to ask Jane. "A little suspicious with my past, so tell me what you saw there." "Mark, you're suspicious for a reason. I saw the same thing you saw, and I'm not going to let Taylor break our son's heart. She's a little nervous and seemed to be too comfortable. Do you think I should call your Uncle Teddy?" Teddy was Jane's uncle, who retired from the Chicago Police Department a few years ago and worked in the security field. Jane's family on her father's side, the Summers, they were all policemen, and on their mother's side, they were connected with this. This created interesting family gatherings. I called my uncle and asked him for a drink. Taylor returned with our drinks and sat with us for a while, as there were only a few other customers. When Carlo came to the table to bring our snack, I took the opportunity to introduce myself and talk to him for a while. It was obvious that Carlo's native language was not English. It took me a couple of questions before I found out he was from Italy. While studying at Loyola, Jane and I finished our drinks and most of the cheese before heading home, where I called Uncle Teddy. The story of Mark Davis. I think I'm being paranoid.
an unpleasant impression of a conversation between two during a break in the workday. How my first marriage ended. Marriage to Paul's biological mother. Her name was Claire. Perhaps it still is, if she is still alive. We haven't talked in 15 years, ever since she showed up at Paul's high school graduation. I married Claire right after I graduated from college. She was a barmaid at the tavern where our group hung out. She was the most beautiful, well-built woman I had ever met. And as a perfect example of thinking with my little head, I started dating her as soon as she showed interest in that guy. I'm sure her had more to do with the fact that I was a grad student. And she'd probably fund. I always had a wad of cash with me, and I always tipped the bartenders, especially the pretty ones, more than the standard rate. Claire agreed to my day, used me on our first night together, and accepted my offer before the end of the semester. My parents tried to dissuade marrying her, but of course, smarter than them. I think it was Mark Twain who said he was how much his own father learned in the 18th and 25th birthdays, or something like that. Whoever said it, and whatever they said, it applied to me in those years of life. Definitely, my grandfather very specifically created trust funds for me and my brother. These included not having access to funds before our 30th birthday, and requiring a prenuptial agreement before marriage. Even without $500,000. I was still very well off. As long as I got good grades, my parents gave me an excellent allowance, and thanks to my parents' connections, I had a fantastic job waiting for me to graduate with an MBA degree. I graduated from high school. Claire signed the prenup. I'm pretty sure she was high and it, but the notary is anything because he was trying to look under her blouse and see her bare breasts. And we got married in Vegas at my parents' with mild objection. I won't say that the whole marriage was terrible. In fact, without causing Jane much trouble, if she reads this, I would say that love was exciting. Although Claire and I have been making love since our first date, she gave her best that week. Claire spent the pool topless, wearing the smallest bikini she could find. In fact, one afternoon, she became friends with a young flight attendant who lent her a wicked weasel swimsuit she bought in the Caribbean. I was sitting in by the pool when the two of them came from Beth's room. Eyes, and I almost choked on my beer.
Are we going to be kicked out of here? I asked. If anyone complains, I'll wear another one, she replied. No one complained, but Claire and Beth spent that day and the next laughing at all the men who found reasons to walk by, flaunting their boners under their suits. In the evening, Claire was no less an exhibitionist. She wore either the tightest jeans with some kind of risque top, there was never a bra underneath, or some version of a little black dress that barely covered her ass and breasts. One evening, she came out of the bedroom in a red silk dress that was almost obscene, complemented by a pair of red heels high enough for her to look directly into my eyes. My height was 180 centimeters, and Claire was 170 centimeters. Where are we going when you're dressed like this? I asked. You'll see, was all she said. As we walked through the lobby, I got a kick out of seeing men and several women turn their heads as Claire walks by. We got into a taxi. Claire handed the taxi driver a note, and we went to Vegas at night. We stopped in front of a strip club. Claire got out of the taxi while I was paying the taxi driver. He grinned, thanked me for the good tip, and wished me to have fun. Before that night, I had only been to a couple of strip clubs in the Midwest. Girls usually looked somewhere between 5 and 8 points. Very few of them danced with real enthusiasm and never without at least a thong to hide their dignity. Vegas was different. Where did all these beautiful women come from? Of course, I know that some, or maybe most of them, had improvements. But if so, then the operation was at the highest level. Claire smiled broadly at me when I looked at the stage and saw two completely naked beauties, each of whom was swinging on a pole. Like this? What is it? She asked. Claire lifted the skirt of her dress to reveal the garter around her upper thigh. She pulled out a couple of $100 bills from behind her garter. "I'm buying you a drink tonight." And she treated me the same way. I had 3 lap dances that night. I used all my willpower to keep from grabbing each dancer's breasts or ass with my hands. 2 hefty bouncers who look like they belong on the defensive line are a strong deterrent. After Claire's private dance, we headed back to the hotel. I wanted to go up to our room immediately, but Claire wanted another drink. We were sitting in the living room, and Claire was trying her best to keep teasing us. "What did you like tonight?" She whispered in my ear. "You mean besides my beautiful wife, dressed in the tightest dress I've ever seen? Or 2 women spinning on poles with the grace of ballerinas? Do you smell that? I'll bet you $100 that she's been in love with someone in the last few hours." "Damn it, Claire. How long are you going to tease me here? What I don't understand is how can you stand it? Don't you need to make love after all this teasing?" "Who said I wasn't used?" Claire said this while looking me straight in the eye and playing with the top of my thigh. "Do you remember how I went to the bathroom while you were dancing the 3rd lap dance? Have you ever wondered why I was gone for so long? Or did you just like that brunette so much that you didn't miss me?" "What do you mean by that?" "I'm saying that my husband had so much fun with the brunette that he didn't notice how his wife left long enough to make love in the men's room with that handsome black gentleman who was sitting at the next table." I was having a hard time digesting Claire's confession. Did she keep teasing me, or did she really just make love to another man and cuckolded me within 4 days of our wedding? Oh, poor Mark. Your face tells me that you want it to be a lie. What is it, my love? It's true. So I answered Claire honestly. If you ever cheat on me, I will divorce you so quickly that you will feel dizzy. Now let's go upstairs. We can get divorced in Vegas almost as easily as getting married. Claire looked depressed, but she didn't argue when I took her hand and practically dragged her to the elevator and back down the hall to our room. I quickly undressed. I needed it. I didn't last more than a minute, but I remained firm, and after a few moments to calm down, I started making love to my wife. I pulled Claire onto my lap. This position allowed me to reach her cervix and tickle her. Claire liked it when I played with her breasts and rocked her hips. She probably had 3 or 4 moments before I let loose a second time. We were lying in each other's arms. I played with her blonde hair with one hand and her ass with the other. It was a great night, but I felt like I had to say one last thing before we fell asleep. I'll take the teasing, but remember what I said. If I ever catch you cheating, it's over between us. I know it's not the most romantic thing a husband can say to his wife after making love, but Claire needed to know how I feel about adultery. We probably conceived Paul that night, or at least during one of the morning, afternoon, or evening periods of our week in Vegas, because 6 weeks later, Claire was holding one of those pregnancy test strips in her hand, and it was showing a positive result. I was thrilled to be having a baby, and Claire seemed happy too. At least she never said a single negative word. We were financially supported by my income. We agreed that Claire could become a stay-at-home mom. Claire's pregnancy went off without a hitch. Paul was born in December, and yes, he was definitely my son. Claire wasn't a great mother, but she was a good mother to Paul. One of our biggest disagreements during Claire's last pregnancy was whether Paul would breastfeed. Claire categorically refused to consider this issue, and after all, you can't force a woman to breastfeed her baby. After Paul's 2nd birthday, Claire wanted to get back to work. Her only profession was bartending. As a compromise, I insisted that there be no eateries or waiting rooms. She had to find an upscale restaurant to work in, otherwise it was impossible. Claire agreed to my demands and 3 months later was hired at one of the best dining clubs in the city. My mom and Claire's mom watched Paul for a few hours when our work schedules coincided. I thought we had a good marriage. I really loved Claire and I thought she felt the same way. After Claire started working, there were no obvious signs of problems. We started spending less time together, but I thought it was temporary until Claire got pregnant again. Unfortunately, there was a snake hiding in the grass, and its name was Neil. Claire and Neil worked at the restaurant together. I met him a couple of times when I was sitting in a bar, which I did sometimes, just to spend a few extra hours with my wife. I had never seen anything between them that could alert me, so that fateful day when I entered our house was a surprise for me. The house was immaculate, and the kitchen was filled with the aroma of my favorite dish. I kissed Claire and gave Paul a high five. "What have I done to deserve this?" I asked. Claire's response was like punching me in the chest. "Mark, it's not easy to say, but I'm leaving tonight with Neil. We're going to California. Neil has a role in a TV series, and he wants me to be there with him. I can't say for sure, but I think I just sat there for a few minutes, looking from Claire to Paul and back again. I finally shook the cobwebs off my head. "You're not taking Paul!" "God, no, Paul stays with you. He's better off here with you and our parents. There's no way I'm going to be able to take care of him while I'm working there. And Neil is not interested in being a parent." I couldn't stand it and started screaming. "You're a fucking fool. You're a fucking cheater. How can you do this to us? How can you leave me and your son? What the hell did I do to deserve this shit?" "You didn't do anything, Mark. But when Neil used me for the first time, I realized that everything was over between us. At that moment, I realized that our almost 3-year-old son had been exposed to the most obscene expressions coming from his parents' mouths." Paul was sitting at the table with a scared expression on his face. I picked him up and sat him down in front of the TV. I turned on a Disney movie with a loud sound, kissed him on the top of his head, and returned to the kitchen. Claire didn't move. "What's so magical about this fool that you have to leave your family?" "Don't ask, Mark, you don't want to know." I controlled myself enough not to scream. "No, I really want to know. You've never seemed disappointed in our lovemaking. You've never complained. What is his secret method of stealing wives from their husbands?" It turns out I shouldn't have asked because her answer caused me to have visions a few months later. Let's just say that the first time we were together, I thought he was going to use me. "Yes, Mark, you're pretty big down there, but Neil is a monster and I'm starting to like it." "Is that all? Are you leaving us for him? Damn, I'll buy you one of those brand new giant dildos at Lover's and you can stay here and raise your son." "Mark, this is not going to get you anywhere. I have withdrawn half of the money from our accounts and I have 2 packed bags in my car. I won't need my winter clothes in Los Angeles, so just give them to charity. I'll let you know where I'll land in Los Angeles, but you still have my cell phone number in case of an emergency." I was still in shock and didn't grab the stone from her left hand before she entered the TV room. She hugged Paul, kissed him, and just walked out the door. The next day I woke up my foggy brain and began to separate our lives. He canceled credit cards, closed joint accounts, and turned to a lawyer to start divorce proceedings. All the usual nonsense. Claire was in Los Angeles. Months later, my recovery slowed down a bit when I saw this asshole one night while watching the channel. I was wondering how Claire took the fact that Neil's character was in bed with some beautiful actress and they were faking love. I didn't handle it well at all. I stopped watching the channel because 2 people were in bed together and I hadn't made love in months. Then I realized that Neil was a man in bed, and to top it all off, he was in bed with some blonde actress who could have been Claire's twin. Let's talk about the wrong time. I turned off the TV, poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, and sent thoughts of bad karma west to Los Angeles. I also enrolled Paul in kindergarten, which he could attend during my working hours. Claire's mom offered to look after Paul for free, but I was so furious at the moment that I refused out of spite. I let her parents take Paul on a day trip on the weekends, but I never let him stay overnight. You can call me petty, but they raised Claire. And somehow I reconciled my actions based on Claire's betrayal. My mom and dad didn't come straight and say, "I told you so," but they got a perverse pleasure from what happened next. It seems that Dad, in the interest of protecting his grandson, took the liberty of hiring a private investigator in Los Angeles to follow Claire and Neil. That's when we found out that they were using illegal substances with some regularity. He also documented their parties. I think Claire didn't mind sharing, and obviously Neil didn't care either. A private investigator made sure that the couple was arrested for illegal substance. My mom and dad didn't come straight and say, "I told you so," but they got a perverse pleasure from what happened next. It seems that Dad, in the interest of protecting his grandson, took the libak. It was at Paul's kindergarten that I met my second wife, Jane. Jane was a teacher at the school and showed a special interest in gender. As expected, Paul found it difficult to adjust to the divorce and the almost complete separation from his mother. Jane's patience and guidance helped Paul overcome the emotional reaction to her departure. I gradually got to know Jane during our weekly half-hour conference where Paul's progress was discussed. Naturally, after a few weeks, Jane and I eventually started talking about ourselves. Jane started asking me questions to determine how I was responding to gender issues. One afternoon, I turned the tables and just asked, "What about you, Miss Summers? What attracts you?" Jane briefly told me what had happened. As a teenager, she developed a tumor that required surgery, which prevented her from having a child. After graduating from high school, she seriously considered becoming a nun, and was actually a novice for 6 months before returning home to attend college with the goal of becoming an elementary school teacher. In the middle of her freshman year, She changed her mind and focused her attention on preschool education and has been working at this school for the last 6 years. I decided to go all in. What about your personal life? Were there any serious guys? Jane looked at me and didn't answer, as if she was wondering how to react to my intrusion into her personal life. Oh, I thought to myself, that's where she tells me she's a lesbian or just doesn't like men. But instead, Jane smiled. I dated, but I never entered into any long-term serious relationship. There was one guy in college, but he really wanted to have children, and this became the main thing in the relationship. I was inspired. Could you let me take you out to dinner sometime? It would be nice to get to know you better and thank you for everything you've done for Paul. Seeing Paul smile and laugh is all the reward I need. But if you want to have dinner together, the answer is yes. That Friday night dinner marked the beginning of a wonderful friendship that turned into a wonderful romance. Paul loved Jane, my parents loved Jane, I loved Jane, but most of all, Jane loved Paul and me. We got married within a year. Maybe someday I'll write more about our courtship and marriage. But if I do, it can be found in the romantic relationships section. Over the next few years, we heard less and less about Claire, and I finally asked Claire if Jane could adopt Paul. I flew to Los Angeles with the documents to discuss this face-to-face. It was the first time we had really talked since the night she left, and I took the opportunity to get some answers. Tell me why, Claire. I can't believe you left for the reason you said that night. No, and I'm sorry that I hurt you so much. We got married too young, Mark. At least I was too young. You know, I was crazy when we met, and I thought our love would change me, but it didn't happen. And then I had a baby while I'm still struggling with all this forever. It was all too much. I thought that work would help me get out and be with adults, but Neil showed up and I screwed up by letting him show off. I didn't say a word while Claire was talking, but she could see the pain in my eyes. You really shouldn't be sad, Mark. You and Paul will be better off without me, and much better off with Jane in your life. Claire and I spent another half-hour talking. She signed the permission to adopt Paul and I kissed her goodbye. To this day, I still can't understand how a mother can let her child go. I think the banned substances had a lot to do with her spiraling down. However, we were all shocked by the level of her decline when Claire showed up at Paul's high school graduation. Neil had been gone for a long time by then. Claire was accompanied by a guy who made Iggy Pop look good. Claire was a skeleton of her old self. I felt sorry for Paul and especially for Claire's parents. How sad it is to see your daughter wasting away. Once again, Jane's love and attention helped Paul get through this nightmare. I have to admit that there were times when I asked God why he wouldn't let a woman like Jane have children of her or not. I came to realize that Jane had not only raised Paul to be the wonderful young man he is today, but also that hundreds of children benefited from Mrs. Davis' preschool activities. Ted and Simoncelli are two good people worth knowing. Uncle Teddy didn't waste any time. Early Thursday morning, a week after my Saturday night call, Teddy knocked on our front door. He sat down across from me. I handed him the beer. My breath. Well, I'll give you the good news. Taylor didn't do anything with Carlo Barzino. I let the air out of my chest. Jane squeezed my hand at the same time. I think it's time to step in. There was a little flirtation between us, and Carlo is a professional charmer. Legally, we couldn't tap Taylor's phone, but based on Carlo's contacts with some questionable individuals who are already under surveillance, my friends from the police obtained a order to wiretap Carlo. He this week. He pretended to ask her advice about her friend. Taylor was friendly on the phone and tried to give him advice on how to manage his relationship. It does not exist, but any of his offers to meet outside of work. So here's the bad news. The Russian mafia tried to get something out of Paul, but couldn't find any dirty laundry on him, so they're trying to come in from the other side. Obviously, the Russians found out that Paul's mother, Claire, had become a cheater. They who has a very unpleasant reputation, first-class gigolo, to find out something about her. Then they will blackmail Paul. I believe that this will turn Paul into an imbecile when he finds out that his wife has turned into the same big cheater as his mother. You've
You've got to be kidding. Do they think it will work? Well, my sources say that there's an Interpol report that tells how it worked once before. There was a prosecutor in Europe when he was shown photos of his wife being used by several men at the same time. The man went crazy and entered a local Russian social club with a gun. He fired a couple of shots before being subdued. A couple of people were injured, killed, but the investigation was suspended and the whole matter was well, my Interpol report that tells how it worked once before. There was a prosecutor in Europe who went berserk when he was shown photos of his wife being used by several men at the same time. The man went crazy and entered a local Russian social club with a gun. He fired a couple of shots before being subdued. A couple injured. No one was killed, but the investigation was suspended and the whole matter was hushed up. I know it sounds too weird to be true, but what about the old saying that facts are strange? Anyway, that my friends from the police told me, it seems that the Russians think they can repeat their scenario here. Good. If that's what's going on, what should we do? First of all, Taylor to tell her what's going on. Secondly, get rid of Carlo because he's probably getting desperate about Paul. So far, he has not committed any crime, so the police cannot intervene. Secondly, get rid of Carlo. He's probably getting desperate about Paul coming home next week. So far, he has not committed any crime, so the police cannot intervene. And as a retired policeman, I cannot be involved in his disappearance, as I will lose my pension. And even worse, Jane, call your mother's brother, Vin. That's his business. Teddy suggested Jane's Uncle Vincent deal with Carlo, which got me thinking. What if Carlo is connected? Do the Sicilians and Russians work together? That's not going to happen, Mark. These guys hate each other. Carlo is, strictly speaking, a gigolo freelancer. He should have known when the Russians hired him and that he was playing with fire. Makes him disappear. There will be one less piece of shit in the city. Ted finished his beer, got up, kissed his niece on the cheek, and walked out the door, saying, no. It was time to act quickly. It was Thursday, and Paul was due to return home the following Tuesday or Wednesday, so it seemed logical that Carlo should have played his play this weekend before Paul returned. Called Vincent. If we could stop by right now, Jane called it and asked her to come over tonight. Never asked Uncle Vin for a favor before. I knew he loved his niece, but he and I were never really close. Did he
Okay, tell Taylor to accept Carlo's offer to meet. I assume he will try to meet on Saturday evening after work. He will pour her a couple of glasses and, if necessary, put illegal substances in her drink for use on a date, and then take advantage of the situation. I know this Carlo. He came to us looking for a job, and we turned him down because of his reputation. It doesn't surprise me that the Russian mafia captured him. The hard cases have no respect for respectable women. I had to ask, will this cause problems between you and the Russians? No. That's why they use an outsider. They think we're too stupid to connect the dots between them, Carlo and my great-nephew. When Vincent said great-nephew, my eyes widened and he noticed the expression on my face. Mark, I know we haven't discussed this. You married my niece, the sweetest girl I know. If I were lucky enough to have a daughter, I would pray that she would grow up to be as beautiful inside and out as Jane. I looked at Jane and she blushed. Vincent continued, and I would pray that she would be lucky enough to find the love that Jane found with you and your son. I pay attention to these things. I know that you two have something that few couples have, and I thank you for sharing it with my niece. Go home. Talk to Taylor and tell her to go out with that clown on Saturday night after work. Nothing's going to happen to Taylor. I guarantee it. With that, Uncle Vincent stood up, shook my hand, and kissed Jane on the top of her head as he hugged her. No doubt both uncles loved her as if she were their own daughter. No matter how difficult it was to ask Uncle Vincent for help, the hardest part was still ahead. Taylor was supposed to come that night. She seemed more relaxed than she had last Saturday afternoon. When we opened the door, she kissed us both and sat down to dinner. I was hoping that was a good sign. Jane took the initiative. Taylor, it's not easy to say this, but Mark and I were alarmed by what we saw on Saturday. Is there something going on between you and this Carlo? Taylor reacted sharply to Jane's questions. Mom, how could you think that? Please, Taylor, I've never insulted your intelligence, don't insult mine. It was quite obvious that the two of you were sharing a moment, even without any obvious physical affection, when Mark and I entered the restaurant. And you were too excited when you realized it was us to claim complete innocence. And even if you didn't think you were having an emotional affair, it was obvious that Carlo thought you were. Taylor burst into tears when Jane finished. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry, Dad. I swear, nothing happened except a little flirtation. I was embarrassed by what you saw on Saturday. I would never do anything to harm Paul. Carlo tried to persuade me to go on a date with him, but I constantly refused him. I admit that during work hours, I let him be more flirtatious than he should have been. He has a way of making it seem innocent. But please believe me when I tell you that there has never been physical intimacy between us, and I never suggested to him that we could be anything more than just friendly colleagues. Now it was my turn. Considering how stressed Taylor was, I had to be careful with the next phase of this intervention. Well, hold your hat, young lady, because you haven't heard everything yet. I continued to tell Taylor about the Russians, and about what Carlo really did as a gigolo, about the incident in Europe and how she fit into the plot. If I hadn't talked directly to Jane's uncles, I would have found it hard to believe, so I wasn't surprised when Taylor asked if we were making this up to scare her to death. Jane, call Uncle Ted. Let Taylor hear it for herself. With Uncle Ted on the line, we watched Taylor get more and more upset when Ted confirmed what we had told her. When she hung up, I handed her a glass of brandy. Taylor took a long sip from her glass and looked a little better. What should I do now? Should I quit? I answered her. No, but what we're going to ask you to do can be very difficult. First of all, and please forgive me for asking this question, do you swear that nothing happened between you and Carlo? I'm sorry, but it all depends on your answer. Taylor had tears in her eyes as she answered. Please believe me, Dad. I've never had anyone but your son since the day we swore our love to each other and became exceptional. If I were that kind of woman, I wouldn't marry Paul. I know how much it hurt him when his biological mother left you two, and I couldn't claim that I loved a man and was doing this to him. I want what you two and my parents have, a lifelong partnership with your soulmate, and for me, that's gender. Taylor, it means so much to me. With that said, if you agree, here's what we need you to do. We've hired a couple of private detectives to keep an eye on you for the next few days. We expect Carlo to ask you to meet him and have a drink before Paul gets home, most likely after work on Saturday night. Accept his invitation. At that, Taylor started shaking her head, no, and looking at me like I was crazy. It's all right, Taylor. Make sure it's a very crowded meeting place. No apartments and other private areas. The detectives will be nearby. Even before you take your first sip, the detectives will step in. I didn't tell Taylor that the detectives were actually connected to Uncle Vincent. If she guessed, then she was smart enough to leave it as it is. When the detectives get involved, one of them will put you in a taxi and they'll take you right here. I also didn't tell Taylor that there wasn't actually a driver in the taxi. It was another one of Vincent's employees. We didn't want to take any chances. As expected, Carlo called Taylor on Friday and asked if she would like to have a drink with him after work on Saturday. He came clean, saying he needed her feminine insight after he was dumped. He acted like his heart would break if he couldn't share his grief with Taylor, because he liked and respected her. Being Italian, he said he needed to know why American women didn't find him worthy or attractive. Taylor tried her best to sound sympathetic and agreed to have a drink with him on Saturday. Taylor went to work late on Saturday, missing the first half of her shift. She told us that there was no way she could handle it, working side by side with Carlo for a full 10-hour shift. At 11 p.m., Taylor's taxi pulled up to the driveway. She walked in the door, sat down on the couch, and cried on Jane's shoulder. Fortunately, this ordeal is over. The epilogue. On Sunday afternoon, we went to dinner with Jane's parents. I wasn't surprised when Uncle Vin showed up. I smelled lasagna and garlic bread in the oven and saw 2 bottles of Sicilian Red on the table. After dinner, he invited Jane and me to the back porch. When Uncle Vin smoked a cigar with pleasure and we all drank after dinner, he told us that he had taken care of everything. Looks like Uncle Vin's 2 guys convinced Carlo to leave the bar after Taylor left. I assumed that firearms and threats were part of the persuasion, since none of the other bar patrons paid attention to it. They found illegal substances in Carlo's possession. Carlo was taken to the warehouse and he sang like a bird while he was being filmed. Carlo told me everything, including where he intended to take Taylor. 2 other guys of Uncle Vin went to the hotel room where they found 3 villains waiting for Carlo and Taylor. 2 cameras on tripods were ready for the event. Taylor was very lucky that night. 3 men at the hotel were found the next day gagged and tied to chairs. All of them will live, but without the use of fingers and toes for several months and extensive rehabilitation. Carlo will never be found. Taylor stayed with us until Paul returned home on Wednesday. It was an emotional evening. Paul was told everything except Uncle Vincent's role in Carlo's disappearance. Paul is a bailiff, and some things can't be shared. We argued that Carlo must have gotten out of town to avoid incurring the wrath of the Russians because of his failure to seduce Taylor. We know that Paul is smarter than to believe that, but he is also smart enough to know when not to ask questions. Taylor held her breath as she told Paul about the flirtation that had been going on between her and Carlo, no matter how innocent he was. The moment was significantly relieved when Paul said that if every couple divorced because of some kind of workplace altercation, there would not be so many marriages left. In fact, he said, he had to admit that he and Sandra Miller, one of the other lawyers in the office, flirted with each other from time to time. We all burst out laughing when Taylor reacted to his confession. "Tell that fool to stay away from my husband." Taylor immediately blushed when she realized what she had said. Paul told his boss about the conspiracy, and let's just say that it didn't help the Russian cause at all. It seems the Russians also tried to ambush a female lawyer working on the case in Paul's office. She put 2 and 2 together when she found out about Carlo and Taylor. A young man she had recently started dating was trying to get her involved in a local swinger club. It was all too much of a coincidence, and she immediately dumped the guy. The full power of the Fed, state, and local law enforcement agencies has come down on the Russians. All of Paul's colleagues had a very vague idea of what the Russians were planning for the 2 of them. And if that wasn't enough, it seems a Sicilian friend of ours sent a message that if his nephew or his nephew's wife were ever harmed, all bets are off. At our 25th anniversary party, I saw Teddy and Vincent talking in the corner. I didn't bother them, but I would really like to be involved in this conversation. Shortly after Taylor quit her job, she spent time preparing children's and volunteer work at the kindergarten. We were surprised to learn that she was carrying twins. The twins were born last month, and yes, they are definitely my son's children. End.